listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. What's it all about, Joshua?
It's all about whiskey, my man.
As I just alluded to there, I am Jason Johnson Yellen, your whiskey wizard, and I am joined by Joshua Hatton, your whiskey cherub. How are you doing, Joshua?
Let's not get into that. I'm fine.
Understood. Moving on. If you're a new listener, and welcome to Season 2, this is our third episode of Season 2. But if you're a new listener of the podcast, every couple of weeks, Joshua or I, whoever's turn it is, will bring a whiskey-related news story to the attention of the other. We spend the first half of the episode reading it, one to the other, and then the second half of the episode riffing on it, having a back and forth, having one of our usual industry chats about a topic. And we try to get this episode turned around in a tight 30, sometimes a tight 35, sometimes a tight 37 and a half. But really we try to keep it at 30 minutes, 35 minutes. Get in, get it said, and get out. And you, Joshua, have the honour of being the chap bringing the news story to our attention. What have you got?
Well, I've decided to change things up in the bedroom, as the kids say. I hope the kids don't say that, but
gosh, that took a turn. Paging HR.
Well, like you'd said, normally we find an article, we bring it to the attention of the other, we read the article, then we riff on it. However, I've got two stories in front of me that tell two very different stories, but I think can potentially allude to a much bigger story that I want to keep an eye on over the next year, 2 years, even 3 years or more. Now, I could be wrong here, but hear me out. Let me read these two articles.
Okay.
And then I will propose what I think this all means.
Okay.
Good? Okay.
Sounds like a very Joshua-heavy episode, but I'm okay with that.
You're welcome. I think our listeners are relieved. Anyway, both of these episodes...
Gonna go put a laundry on? Carry on.
Both of these articles have shown up on the spirits business, which for any of our listeners, it's a great little website to go to, thespiritsbusiness.com.
Indeed.
And the first article was released on 12th of February, written by Owen Bellwood. And the title simply states, Scotch whiskey exports plummet 1.1 billion pounds in 2020. That's article number one.
Just very quickly, you're not going to make a Blues Brothers reference on that name?
We got to bring the band back together? I don't know. We play
Bellwood?
both kinds, country and Western.
Bellwood.
Yeah, I'm not really Blues Brothers. I saw it years ago, and I don't remember much of it. Calm down.
Paging 3M. Paging 3M. The movie's like 3 hours long. Anyway, get back to your articles.
So this is Article 1. That was the headline of Article 1. The headline of Article 2 reads, Japanese whiskey faces stricter labeling rules.
Interestingly, these don't sound like they've got anything in common with one another.
They don't, but hear me out, and you and our listeners will get an understanding of how my brain works or doesn't work. So the subheader on the first one, which discusses the plummeting of the Scotch whiskey exports, plummeting again by 1.1 billion pounds in 2020, the subheader says, the value of Scotch whiskey imports fell by 1.1 billion pounds or 1.5 billion US in 2020 to its lowest level in a decade as a result of the pandemic and U.S. imposed tariffs, according to the Scotch Whisky Association. Okay, let's dig into this a bit further.
Okay.
In 2020, exports of Scotch whiskey fell by 23% by value to 3.8 billion, and that's in pounds, or 5.3 billion U.S. The number of 700 milliliter bottles exported dropped by 13% to the equivalent of 1.14 billion. So this is a good thing to think about, right? This article doesn't specify tariffs. It's talking about tariffs and how COVID has affected things, and not even
It's a left-right punch.
Yeah, it's a left-right punch. Let's not forget the third punch, which is Brexit, which will be all telling after 2021 is said and done. But anyway,
Only so much bad news we can take at any one moment, Joshua.
According to the Scotch Whisky Association, SWA, the export figures are the lowest they've been in a decade due to the impact of COVID-19 and the 25% tariffs placed on Scotch whiskey by the U.S. The U.S. is Scotch whiskey's most valuable market and was worth more than £1 billion or 1.4 billion U.S. in 2019. However, in 2020, exports of Scotch whiskey to the country fell by 32% to £729 million or $1 billion, which accounted for around 1/3 of total global export losses. Massive. It continues.
Absolutely huge.
It continues. Since the 25% tariff was imposed in October 2019, Scotch whiskey exports to the U.S. have fallen 35%, or 542 million pounds, again, or $750 million.
Like losing a third. That's... It's like an asteroid falling out the sky.
Yes.
I lost a third. Good grief.
Karen Betts, chief executive of the SWA, said, quote, "These figures are a grim reminder of the challenges faced by distillers over the past year, as exports stalled in the face of the coronavirus pandemic and U.S. tariffs. In effect, the industry," and listen to this sentence, Jason, "in effect, the industry lost 10 years of growth in 2020 and is going to take some time to build back to a position of strength." How long has our company been around, Jason?
10 years.
10 years. And in the span of 1 year, right? Think about that.
Gosh, this really is a lot to take on.
You're welcome. It goes on, or Miss Betts' quote continues, "In these challenging times, what's so disappointing is the damage being caused by U.S. tariffs. The U.S. has been, for decades, our strongest and most valuable market, but Scotch whiskey is now losing considerable ground there." She continues, "These tariffs were avoidable had the UK, EU, and U.S. governments and the European and American aerospace industries been less intransigent. That governments and companies have allowed their dispute to continue while the livelihoods of real people and the future of one of Scotland's oldest industries are put at stake reflects badly on them."
Yeah.
And that ends her quote.
Just very, very quickly to pivot back to it, they are talking about the US as the most valuable market. You're then talking,
Dollars.
value imports. You're not necessarily talking volume, but it kind of gives you a sense of what is well received in the US market and what is purchased in the US market. It's not bottom shelf blends, right? It's single malts and good single malts. And by that, I'm meaning, $50, $60 single malts that are very different market from your blends. Obviously, there's still blends coming in here, but it goes to show the dollar value sits a little higher in America than it does in other markets. Just a point worth making.
Yeah, and as you mentioned blends, it's good to remember that overall, globally, blends have gone from around 95% of overall Scotch whiskey sales to between 88 and 90%. The story continues. Exports to the 27 member states in the European Union, the industry's largest regional export market, also fell by 15% as a result of the closure of the hospitality and travel restrictions impacting airport retail.
There you go.
Yep.
Airport retail, hospitality, tariffs, Gosh. Okay. Yep. Chin up, little engine. Keep going.
So the second half of this article has its own subheader that says, in quotes, reassure distillers. And so the story continues and says, as a result of the detrimental impact tariffs and the COVID-19 pandemic are having on the Scotch whiskey sector, the SWA has repeated its calls for greater support for distillers. Betts added, quote, the Scotch whiskey industry has now paid over £500 million in tariffs. And I want to pause here really quickly because you and I know the people who are really paying these tariffs are the U.S. importers of Scotch whiskey. And then those tariffs are passed on to the consumer. Now, in some cases, you've got importers that are working with suppliers to try to mitigate some of these tariffs, to try to, see that less falls on to the consumer. But really, when she's talking about the Scotch whiskey industry having paid £500 million in tariffs, it's the U.S. side of the Scotch whiskey industry that's been bearing the brunt of these payments. Now, Scotch whiskey producers have lost money, and that's its own thing. So you have us paying a shit ton, and the distilleries losing a shit ton.
Well, do you remember the number that was on the settlement? Was it 7 billion?
About 7 billion, yeah.
Was it about that? And so look at that. Even with 18 months of painful tariffs, we've got £500 million covered on that. Mm-hmm. Like we're not even close.
Yep,
it's like a kid putting pennies into their piggy bank. Yeah. It's like, well done, you've managed to layer the belly with pennies. Now keep filling the entire piggy bank.
And like you've said many times, these tariffs are a form of cruel and unusual punishment to an industry that has nothing to do with what the real issue was, that dispute between Airbus and Boeing. But let's save our comments for later. I need to finish these stories. So I'm going to go back. Again, Betts added, quote, the Scotch whiskey industry has now paid over £500 million in tariffs, which are a form of tax, on behalf of the UK government because of the subsidies that the government granted to the aerospace sector in breach of World Trade Organization rules. She continues, So we are calling on the Chancellor to support Scotch whiskey distillers by reducing our tax bill in the UK. Rishi Sunak, can you explain to people who Rishi Sunak is?
Yeah, of course. That's the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK government. And they will present their budget in March. The Chancellor always presents a budget in March to the Houses of Parliament, back when they used to meet at the Houses of Parliament in Westminster. Okay. It's a very different world, yes. So
Rishi Sunak can, and by the way, this is still a quote by Miss Betts, Rishi Sunak can do that by cutting spirits duty in next month's budget. There you go. There's March, right? Mm-hmm. That will help to mitigate the damage being done to Scotch whiskey and help to reassure distillers that the UK government wants to support Scotch whiskey in riding out the current storm and returning to growth when possible. Okay? That's story number one. Let's keep this story in mind, okay? A third of overall exports gone by the stroke of 2020. Boom. That's gone because of the U.S. tariffs, because of COVID and how COVID has affected both the hospitality industry worldwide and the retail travel industry, again, worldwide. So keep that in mind. Now, the next article, again, the headline is Japanese Whiskey Faces Stricter Labeling Rules. Now, this article came out today, which is February 16, and was written by Melita Kiley. And the The subheader says, the Japanese Spirits and Liquors Makers Association has issued new guidelines on the production and labeling of Japanese whiskey to offer greater transparency across the category.
This is something we've been hearing about, rumors around, whisperings about, and so I'm glad we can fold it into this episode, and bless you for making a connection to your first article with this.
You're welcome. The new standards for labeling Japanese whiskey aim to, quote, protect the interests of consumers, ensure fair competition among businesses, and improve quality, end quote, the Japanese Spirits and Liquor Makers Association said. The new production standards stipulate that malt must always be used in the making of Japanese whiskey, but other grains can also be used. Water used in Japanese whiskey making must come from Japan. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing this word right that opens up the next sentence, but saccharification, which is the conversion of starch into sugars during the matching process.
Makes sense.
Right? Fermentation and distillation should be done at a distillery in Japan. Distillation must be to no more than 95% ABV. Maturation should take place in wooden barrels, doesn't specify oak, it just says wooden barrels, with a maximum capacity of 700 liters. Japanese whiskey must be matured in Japan for at least 3 years. Bottling must take place in Japan at a minimum strength of 40% ABV. Caramel coloring can be used. To be labeled, quote, Japanese whiskey, all of the above terms and conditions must be met. Furthermore, a product's name, labeling, and marketing should not imply that it is Japanese whiskey. This includes the use of place names such as cities, arenas, scenic spots, mountains, rivers, national flag, and more. Members of the Japanese Spirits and Liquors Makers Association will begin working to the new standards from 1st of April 2021. Producers have until the 31st of March 2024 to adhere to the new regulations.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that first date sounded pretty soon, but okay. They've got a longer runway to fit into that. Okay.
Yeah. And then the final sentence, or as you like to say, the final salvo, says,
oh, gosh.
The spirits business has previously reported on Japanese whiskey's practice of blending imported liquid from other parts of the world, which has raised, and then they put a link to these next 6 words, questions about brands' claims of authenticity, period.
Whoa, okay. That's the end of, gosh, questions afoot. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back for the second half chat.
My question to you, Jason, why do you think I put these 2 stories together?
That's like saying, so teacher, why do you think I think you assigned this homework?
Other than wanting to get more airtime, because that's not the only reason why I put these 2 stories together.
Well, I before I answer that question, I have a question for you, which is that stipulation about malt. Malt must be a part of Japanese whiskey, although other grains are allowed. Is there some percentage of malt? And I assume it's malted barley, not malt whiskey, that's going in here as a raw ingredient.
It doesn't, at least the article doesn't specify, right? I think it's purposefully being a bit squishy there. It doesn't specify, and to be honest, I haven't found any other articles that went into deeper detail beyond what's being shown here. Even Becky Paskin on Instagram, and that's where I first found out about it, had posted basically what I read here. So if someone like Becky Paskin doesn't have information beyond this, then my guess is if more information is to be made available, we'll see that in the coming months and so on.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about our friends at Fukano and Oishi, who I've been thoroughly enjoying. Oishi Mizunara Oak. I know this is extra. I don't tend to buy into the hype surrounding Mizunara Oak. I tend to avoid it or find myself underwhelmed by it. Mm-hmm. The Oishi Mizunara Oak finish is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
But these rules still do not... I don't think, personally, I could be wrong here, but I don't think they have anything to do with Fukano or Oishi or any other brand of rice-based distillate that is labeled as whiskey in the U.S., because even before this, rice-based distillates within Japan could not be called whiskey within Japan and could not be called whiskey within the UK, and that goes back to... And listeners may remember previous episodes with Chris Udy, where we talked about this trade dispute between Margaret Thatcher's parliament and Japan. Anyway.
Indeed.
The reason why Oishi, Fukano, and there are other brands, Kokori and a few others, the reason why those brands can come into the U.S. and be labeled as whiskey is because as far as U.S. rules go, when it comes to whiskey, it's very simple. It's a spirit from a grain above 40% alcohol, So,
yep.
So that may not be an issue.
Cool.
Again,
cool.
we will see. I sure as heck hope. I almost said fuck, but I decided to say heck. I sure as heck hope that it won't be an issue because, like you, it's the spirits are absolutely beautiful, and it tastes of whiskey, and it's different. And like Chris Udy had said before, it's not taking away from other categories. It's expanding the pie. It's adding new flavors to the overall whiskey flavor palette. So, Anyway.
Yeah. Cool. No, good. You even answered my follow-up in the answer to my first question. So good job. So to pivot back to your question, which is why do I think you've brought these two together? Aside from this being one more place where Scotch might not be able to be sent, although I think you'll see new labels and new product styles coming out of it. I don't think it's a dead end. Aside from that, I'm curious why you did bring them together.
Well, Scotch whiskey distilleries, again, using our favorite term, writ large, continue to produce spirit, most of them at capacity. Sure, some have pulled back. Right? There's been talk of Kalila pulling back and some other distilleries pulling back a little bit here and there. But generally speaking, they're producing to capacity. If you have distilleries producing to capacity, but their route to market has been cut by 33% just in Scotch whiskey exports, and the route to market from distilleries producing spirit that would then go to Japan to go into some sort of a pure malt blend, we're going to see that either it'll go away, my guess, in some capacity. My hope is that they'll figure out some creative ways of creating new Japanese whiskey labels that allow for them to continue to do this, because regardless of where the whiskey comes from, Japanese pure malts are lovely whiskeys. Just like Compass Box makes lovely blends.
Correct.
These Japanese pure malts are lovely blends. Instead of Compass Box using Scotch whiskey as the various tools, Japanese producers had the freedom to use whiskeys from all over the world to make blends. So I don't want them to go away, but I do see that closing off a bit. And so if if Scotland's exports of spirit to Japan start to dwindle, and just in the past years, the Scotch whiskey industry lost a third of its overall exports, that's a lot of available whiskey. It seems almost as if these two stories and the fact that we haven't even taken Brexit into account, though you and I know shipping single cask nation into European Union countries is really difficult right now.
Paging Jess Lomas.
All of this says to me this is a potential modern whiskey loch growing.
So we have a few factors in play here where if you're any type of producer in Scotland, you're always looking 10 years into the future. And could you imagine 10 years ago trying to predict US tariffs, a global pandemic, and a Brexit, a separation from Europe on the horizon? Like those are, each one of those is a once in a lifetime event. Mm-hmm. And all three of them are happening now in 2021, although only two of them were happening last year in 2020. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of 10-year-old whiskey that hasn't had a place to go. And you're able to say as a producer, okay, let's slow down production. Let's turn down the taps a little bit here. Mm-hmm. But you don't see that right away. Mm-hmm. You see that 10 years after you start to turn down the taps. And so I don't know if it's going to be a loch that becomes quite as serious as we saw the 60s, the 80s, distinct problems there. For 5 years, producers have known that Brexit has been on the horizon. Mm-hmm. So I could see them working carefully around that. Mm-hmm. And for a couple of years, we've been hearing about clarifying the use of language around Japanese whiskey and being clear on labels. And so if you're a producer, and they're all smart producers these days, they did see some aspects. They would have seen some aspects on the horizon. But going back 10 years ago, were you seeing any of that?
No, but I think that the problem is much bigger than we're thinking about, or at least that I was thinking about. And as you were talking, it's not that I wasn't listening to you. Mm-hmm. It was that my brain was also working. Let's think about this. Right, what did I say before about Scotch whiskey blends? Where it used to be 95% of the overall market, now we're looking at 88 to 90% of the overall market. What has COVID done to the hospitality market, to bars and restaurants? Decimated. There's no home for these blends to be going into. Now think about your 120, 130 Scotch whiskey distilleries, 140, whatever the number is, and you've got around 50% of them, if not a little more, whose sole job is to produce spirit to go into these blends that no longer have a home, that have been losing homes over the past 10 to 15 years. So, to the average consumer, they're thinking about Johnny Walker and Chivas and Glenlivet and Macallan. Before us as the independent bottler, we're thinking of Milton Duff and
a Thrusk
and Dalyuane and all of these distilleries, and it really has me nervous that this can be a fairly large loch. Now, my concern is, if you think back to the loch that was created in the 80s, we got the understanding that there was a downturn in overall sales leading up to the end of the 70s. It progressed And then starting in around 83, distilleries started shuttering. 83 through 86, they started shuttering, right? I'm very concerned that we are going to start seeing a shuttering if these distilleries don't start slowing down taps sooner rather than later, though many of them are now owned by publicly held companies. They have to answer to their stockholders. They're gonna dance a dance, and I'm just afraid some companies may get it wrong, and we're going to see a lot of more jobs being lost. And
and I wonder, there's a couple of factors in what you're describing there. Is we've seen a recent slowdown in the markets where blends were king. Make no mistake, blends remain king. But we have been seeing a slowdown, as you just pointed out there. We've been seeing that slowdown happening. However, in 2020, it went off a cliff. And so I wonder if you're a multinational conglomerate, if you're already looking down the road to when this comes back up again, right? And you're saying, okay, if we go through, and I'm just making up numbers here, if we go through a 1 year slowdown, a 2 year slowdown, a 3 year slowdown, hospitality will come back. Travel retail will come back. We haven't lost a demand from consumers.
Correct.
As much as blends, we're seeing a slowdown. The demand from consumers hasn't fallen off a cliff. It's how we get products to those thirsty consumers that have currently taken a hit with tariffs and a loss of travel retail and a loss of hospitality. And so if you watch the industry media, Diageo have put millions of pounds and dollars into supporting hospitality during this downturn.
Very true.
And
Very true.
Other companies have done this as well. Pernod Ricard, just one other that comes to mind right now, but other companies have done this because that's your route to consumer, and you need to protect them during this downtime to return. So that's why I wonder if you start to see this protection of production for 1, 2, 3 years, knowing that you're going to get a market that you're not rebuilding from scratch.
Yeah.
You're hoping to jump back on again at 50% capacity, 60, 70%. Again, I don't know the numbers there, but I wonder if that's what you look at as the rebound from an impossible 2020 and then what's going to be an incredibly difficult 2021 and perhaps 2022.
That's a really good point about demand, where in previous downtimes for the whiskey industry, it was because there was a lack of demand, and also economic factors took into play. But we live in a modern internet world where everybody has FOMO, everybody's brand conscious. People want to reward themselves, and they want to do it now. The demand hasn't gone away. So that gives me some hope, because without the demand, let's again, and maybe we can end on this, but maybe you have a final comment you want to add in here. Without the demand, think about what happened in the 80s. Again, early 80s distilleries closed, and the industry continued to just move along sluggishly. And then in 1995, and I'll just use the example of Isle of Arran Distillery, that distillery opened at a time when people weren't really giving a shit about whiskey. 1995, whiskey was still not a thing. It wasn't until 2005 that whiskey started kicking off. 2005, 2006, and you start seeing more and more distilleries ramping up production and so on. And so from let's just say 1981 to 2005, it took all that time to bring an industry back. And then between 2005 to 2019, the amount of growth that the industry has seen, and now it's we're back down into first gear, right? It's just like, whew, stop.
Yeah. It's interesting looking at these markers, and fall of 1996 was the beginning of my single malt journey. Mm-hmm. And so I've kind of lived that life of, there's young people like me getting into this. They know as much as I do, but gosh, we're passionate and we're reading books by Michael Jackson, and we're learning about this through that moment in around 05, 06, where producers start to say, oh, there's a lot out there. Oh, oh gosh, this is global. Into 2010, when you and I started talking about launching an independent bottling company, when you actually had producers say, oh, we actually have to close off some of our routes to market here because we need to protect our brand. And cask sales dipped.
Yes,
The availability of casks in 2010 was a kind of a moment of, we're probably not going to do that anymore, or at least for the foreseeable. We still were able to build the company. And the thing that I would like to get out of here on is, as we're talking about a loss of export, as we're talking about a lesser demand on blends, as we're talking about the demise of hospitality, our nation members are single malt, single cask strength lovers.
Yes.
That's their thing. We're not on every back bar in the country. We're not on every back bar around the world. Some of these Scottish brands are.
Yeah.
And that is insane volume. And so, Mark Watt always says it, in times of boom, independent bottlers are a pain in the tuchus for these, bigger brands. In times of downturn, independent bottlers are their best friends. And I would say, big producers, call us. We'll take your calls. There's some casks that we would love to buy from you, help you with some of your shortfall.
Indeed. Just remember, though, that we prefer pricing to be industry pricing and not pricing for quote-unquote investor pricing. Oh, geez. Imagine what this is doing to the investor market. If the market's being flooded with whiskey that can't sell, oof, these poor investors.
Hey, that's a good point that you raised right at the end. Let's get out of here on that point. If you would like to drop us an email, please send us a note, a missive, if you will, to questions@onenationunderwhiskey.com. No E in whiskey. You can also search out the Extra Facebook page. Honestly, that has nothing to do with me. I haven't even looked at it, and I do apologize, Joshua. You are the man behind that Facebook page. And so please, listeners, go and support Joshua. He works hard at this. I'm certainly not supporting him. But you, please, go support him. That would be a personal favor to me. Whiskey Cherub, thank you.
Well, Whiskey Wizard, I thank you.
And dear listener, thank you as always. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with the next Extra. And 1 week from now, look for the launch of Season 5 of One Nation Under Whiskey. We have an extra special guest who we've been chasing for a little while. But with the interest of time, we better call this meeting to a close. We'll catch you on the flip. Cheers.
Cheers.